What if I told you that one of darts' most electrifying players wasn't just a world champion, but a man whose sheer unpredictability made him a living highlight reel? A player who, at his peak, was so feared that even the best in the game had no idea what he was about to do next. Jocky Wilson wasn't just great, he was chaos personified. His throwing style was unconventional and his technique defied logic. But when he got in the zone, there were few who could touch him. He could dismantle legends, create moments that felt scripted, and make the impossible look routine.
He had a very shaky start against Lazarenko. Couldn't finish in the earlier sets. The third leg, we have just seen two maximums, one from each player.
Yet despite the brilliance, Jocky's career was a roller coaster. He didn't just rise, he erupted onto the scene. And just as quickly as he climbed, the cracks started to show. Jocky's career wasn't just about wins and losses, it was a spectacle. A whirlwind of raw talent, unstoppable highs and brutal collapses. So, just how good was Prime Jockey Wilson? And why, despite his undeniable talent, is he not spoken about in the same breath as the very best? To answer that, we need to go back to the beginning. Jocky Wilson didn't enter the world of darts through the usual channels. He wasn't some polished prodigy who climbed the ranks of the youth circuits, nor was he groomed for stardom from an early age. No, his story began in the working-class town of Kirkcaldy, Scotland, where darts wasn't a sport, it was an escape. And for Jocky, it wasn't just an escape from the mundane, it was an escape from everything. Before he ever stepped onto a professional stage, Wilson's life had already been shaped by struggle. He worked as a coal miner, a job that didn't exactly lend itself to precision hand-eye coordination. But while most saw a dead-end career, Jocky saw something else, a way out. Nights spent in smoky pubs weren't just about knocking back pints, they were his training ground. And it quickly became apparent that he had something the others didn't. His style, unorthodox, to say the least. While most players prided themselves on textbook technique, textbook meaning robotic, Jocky played as if he was making it up as he went along. His throwing action was jerky, his grip unconventional, and his rhythm, if you could call it that, it was erratic at best. But somehow, it worked. The darts landed, and when they did, they often sent shockwaves through the room. He wasn't elegant, but he was effective. He didn't play for approval, he played to win, and that made him dangerous. By the late 1970s, Jocky's name was beginning to spread beyond the local leagues. He wasn't just some pub champion anymore, he was a force. His reputation was built on unpredictability, and that made him a nightmare to face. Opponents couldn't read him. He didn't have the smooth approach of an Eric Bristow or the composed precision of a John Lowe. He was raw, volatile, and just when you thought he was on the verge of self-destruction, he'd fire off a string of perfect darts that left you wondering if you'd just been hustled. His breakthrough moment came in the early 80s, when he burst onto the professional scene with the same reckless energy he carried everywhere else. There was no adjustment period, no easing into the spotlight. Jocky arrived as if he'd been there all along, and in truth, he had been. Maybe not on TV, but in the smoky backrooms where real darts were played, he'd been sharpening his craft for years. Now, he finally had the stage to prove it. His first major statement came in the World Championship, where he did more than just hold his own. He announced himself as a legitimate contender. The pressure, he thrived on it. The doubters, he silenced them. And for those who thought his erratic playing style would collapse under the bright lights, they were about to learn something crucial about Jocky Wilson. He didn't crumble, he doubled down.
So, one dart could give him the World Championship double 16.
Yeah! Time's up! And match to Jocky Wilson, 1982.
Jocky wins! Lowe congratulates him!
What followed was a rapid rise, but one that carried an edge of unpredictability, because with Jocky, nothing was ever straightforward. He wasn't just winning matches, he was creating moments. Some were genius, some were disastrous, but none were boring. And as he clawed his way towards the top of the sport, one thing became clear. Darts had never seen anyone quite like him before. But the real question wasn't whether he could win, it was how long he could keep the chaos under control.
Jocky slips on the deck, but rises to greet the victor.
The second World Championship in 1989 was the final proof that Jocky Wilson's chaos could be controlled when it mattered most. Against an on-form Eric Bristow in the final, he delivered one of the most memorable performances in darts history. It was a clash of opposites. Bristow dictated the pace versus Jocky, a player who didn't seem to care for convention.
Double 10 to take the title. Double 10. Yes! Jocky Wilson! Champion of the world in 1982 does it! But what an amazing comeback by Bristow!
And as the sport began to change, as the new generation of methodical, highly trained players emerged, Jocky's ability wasn't able to keep up. The first real cracks started to show in the early 1990s. It wasn't just one bad match. The fire that once carried him through brutal encounters flickered at the wrong moments. The sort of things that could be chalked up to variance, bad luck, an off night, nothing more. But then it started happening more often. The problem with Jocky's style was that it didn't allow for dips in confidence. He played like a man throwing punches in the dark, hoping to land first. And when he stopped landing, the game caught up with him fast. But this wasn't just about age or natural decline. The game itself was changing, and not in his favor. The new generation of players wasn't like the one he had conquered in the 80s. They were more disciplined, more clinical. The sport was shifting towards consistency, precision, and measured control. The kind of play that rewarded repetition over risk. Jocky, by contrast, was never consistent. There were personal battles too. His drinking, long a part of his public persona, became less of a backdrop and more of a burden. In the early years, it had fueled his legend, the pint-clutching, chain-smoking wildcard who could outplay the best in the world on sheer audacity. But what was once a part of his mystique soon became a liability. The sport was professionalizing, prize money was growing, and players were treating it with a level of discipline that simply hadn't been necessary before. Jocky's approach, once thrilling, now looked reckless. Jocky refused to adapt with the sport. He was even famously known for never brushing his teeth, a habit that eventually led to him losing them entirely. In his prime, these excesses were part of his legend. He could roll into a tournament after a night of drinking and still take down world-class opponents. But over time, the consequences became unavoidable. Years of heavy drinking caught up with him, contributing to his struggles both on and off the oche. By the time he left the game, he wasn't just losing matches, he was losing his health. His final years were spent in relative isolation, suffering from chronic pulmonary disease, a far cry from the loud, unpredictable presence that once dominated the darts world. And then came the losses, the ones that really stung, the ones where it wasn't just about being outplayed, it was about no longer being feared. The moment opponents stopped seeing him as a threat, everything changed. The aura that had carried him to 2 world titles was fading. The younger players weren't intimidated, and even those who once dreaded facing him started to feel comfortable. He had gone from being the man who could shake the board with a single run of darts to someone struggling to hang on. There are those who argue his decline was inevitable, that his style of play was never sustainable. But there's another perspective, one that suggests Jocky's fall wasn't just about his approach. It was about timing. If he had peaked in an earlier era, where the game was still raw and unpredictable, he might have lasted longer at the top. But he reached his prime just as darts was transitioning into something more structured, more professional, and more unforgiving. By the mid-90s, his decline was undeniable. His exits became earlier, his presence felt smaller, and then just like that, he was gone. Not with a final dramatic clash, no glorious last stand, but with a quiet fade into the background. But here's the thing about legends, they don't disappear. Even in decline, even in the years after he left the game, Jocky Wilson's name never really faded, because while his career may have ended, his impact hadn't. And whether the world of darts realized it or not, the sport had lost something when it lost Jocky Wilson. But was he truly underrated, or was his legacy exactly what it was meant to be? Jocky Wilson exists in a strange space in darts history. He is both a cult hero and a 2-time world champion. Yet somehow, he isn't always mentioned in the same breath as the sport's most celebrated names. Maybe it's because his career didn't have the longevity of a Phil Taylor. Maybe it's because darts has never quite known what to do with a player like Jocky Wilson. He wasn't a role model, not in the traditional sense. He didn't represent the cold-blooded professionalism that modern darts celebrates. He wasn't a player others studied to perfect their game. If anything, he was a reminder that sport isn't just about mechanical precision, it's about character, and that's what made him unforgettable. The players who came after him didn't try to be Jocky Wilson, but they couldn't ignore him either. He represented the last gasp of a wilder, more unpredictable era of darts. His influence isn't measured in trophies but in the stories, in the moments that still get brought up decades later. But where does he rank? That depends on how you define greatness. If it's about sustained dominance, he falls short. If it's about cold, hard numbers, he isn't at the very top. But if it's about impact, about the moments that define a sport, about the kind of player who changes the atmosphere the second they step up to the oche, then Jocky Wilson belongs in the conversation with the very best. In truth, darts needs characters like him. The game thrives on unpredictability, on players who don't just win but make people care. And in that sense, Jocky Wilson was a giant. His legacy isn't just in what he achieved, but in how he did it. Flawed, unfiltered, and utterly compelling. Jocky passed away in 2012, leaving behind not just a trophy cabinet, but a myth. The kind of figure who will always be remembered, not just for what he won, but for who he was. And that, more than anything else, is why he still matters. Jocky Wilson was a reminder that darts isn't just about numbers. It's about moments, personality, and the raw thrill of competition. And while the game has changed, every so often, a player comes along who shakes things up all over again. Right now, that player is Luke Littler, a young phenom taking the darts world by storm. But is he the future of the sport, or just the latest sensation? Click here to find out.